All right? So when we look at that word pisteo, clearly Mark is saying, or Jesus is saying rather, in the Gospel of Mark, you have to put your pisteo, your faith, you have to put that into some sort of good news concerning a specific person who happens to be God. So here's what we'll do. I want to define the word gospel in order for you to understand how to put your faith into it. That seems to make sense. And I want to do that in the same way that I teach it to some of your kids. If your kids are in kids' church, like Dan said, I usually teach the kids over in kids' church, and I taught them this gospel outline to help them. And I want to use that for a couple ways. One, it's really simple. And so it's easy for you to remember what the gospel is and what it's not. Number two, if you have kids, you need to train your kids in the gospel, right? You need to teach them. And so you can use this tool to help them understand and practice it and recite it and talk about it, right? All right, so let's do that. I split it into two parts, really. And it's who he is and what he did. All right, so the first part is who he is, who is Jesus, what's his identity, and the other side is what has he done with that identity. So those two are really related. They go together hand in hand. You can't have Jesus' mission without his identity, and you can't have his identity without his saving work. So you got to have who he is and what he's done. And Mark writes this book for the sole purpose of proving that, right? In the beginning, he says, this is the gospel. My whole point of writing this book is to proclaim this gospel, and then the whole book is split into two main sections. Section 1 goes from chapter 1:1 all the way to chapter 8, verse 27. And the whole point of that first part is, who is Jesus? And you see him casting out demons. You see him preaching with authority. You see him healing the sick, and the disciples are freaking out. Who is this guy? Because he's not like any other rabbi we've seen. One of the greatest parts, this was a couple weeks ago, if you were here, we taught on when Jesus rebukes the wind. Imagine that in a lightning storm the other night. Just Jesus goes outside, knock it off. Stopped. And the disciples are freaking out like, who is this guy? Because he just told the wind to stop and it listened. And so it's this building crescendo. Who is he? Who is he? Who is he? And then right at the climax, it's getting to the big, and he says, looks at Peter and says, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you're the Christ. And he's like, nailed it. Yes, got it. So now you guys are starting to get your head around who I am. And right after that, Jesus says, good, you get that I'm the Christ. My job now, I'm going to go to Jerusalem and be crucified for sinners. And Peter's like, what? No, it's not what the Christ is supposed to do. So Peter has grasped, at the halfway point, he's grasped the man, but he doesn't get the mission. If you look up on this huge graphic behind me, we see that it says the king and his cross. We've dedicated the first part of the book to seeing, who is he? He's the king. He's the reigning king of the universe. He's God become man. And then the second half of the book is going to be dedicated to what is he doing? What's his mission? What is he trying to accomplish? And that's what the second half of the book is, and that's where we find ourselves today. So, again, when I teach the kids, when we break down what he's done, we break it into 5 major parts. He came, he lived, he died, he rose, and he's coming again. Sometimes we add a 6th one in there called he sent, but we'll take that out for now. He came, he lived, he died, he rose, and he's coming again. So let's break that open for a second. The good news starts with the God-man, Jesus, coming into human history as a human. I was talking to a friend like 2 nights ago who just got back from Israel. And so we were talking on the beach the other night, and she said to me, she goes, it really kind of demystified the Bible, because I used to read Bethlehem and think magical fairy Narnia, and just think, this is a magical place where things happen and dead people rise. And then she said she went there, and it's like, it's just another place. Think Townsend. It's just a small town. That was funny. So it's just another town. Jesus didn't come into Narnia. Jesus came into real place, a sandy wasteland, kind of. He came into the real world. And the second part is that he lived. You have to understand that Jesus lived a life without any sin. That's what the Bible tells us in places like 2 Corinthians 5 and Hebrews 4, that God made him who knew no sin to become sin. Or he was tempted in every way as we were, yet was without sin. Jesus lived a sinless, perfect life to the glory of God. The one that we're called to live, but mess up a lot, yeah, that one. That's what he lived. And then he gets on the cross. In the Gospel of John, he says, you don't take my life. I give up my life, right? You can't kill God without God kind of having that in his plan. So he dies. He gets on a cross. He's crucified. And then he, after staying dead for a couple days, pops up out of the grave like, get off of me. He's God. He's verifying, one, that the debt paid for sin has cleared, the check cleared, and he's also verifying his identity, because only God can go into a grave dead for 3 days and get up and walk out. And then he ascends up into heaven, ruling and reigning, and says, I'm coming again to judge the living and the dead, to make all things new, and those who put their faith in me will live with me in the eternal heaven, with eternal life. And that's the gospel in a nutshell. And that's when Jesus says, you don't have pisteo, you don't have belief. He's referring to this message. He's referring to this gospel. He's referring to this news of Jesus is the king and he died on a cross for us. And that's, if we're the church here, if you've put your faith in Jesus, that's your lifeline. That's everything to you. And you want to put more and more, as you're being sanctified, that just means you're putting your faith more and more in that gospel message, more and more in that person and that work.